The man who stood before the assembly was not a suitor, he was a reckoning. The Duke of Alastair, Lord Cassian Vale, a name whispered in drawing rooms with a shiver of fear and morbid curiosity. He was a creature of rumour, a recluse, a tyrant, a man whose first wife had met a tragic, unspoken end. His appearance at an event designed for the delicate commerce of marriage was like a hawk descending upon a dovecote. Silence followed him as he moved, a ripple of parted silks and arrested breaths. He ignored the hopeful, curated presentations of London's most polished debutantes. His gaze, a severe, assessing grey, swept past blushing cheeks and practised smiles. It swept past her own stepsister, Arabella, whose beauty was a carefully tended weapon, now aimed uselessly at a man who clearly had no interest in such campaigns. Ilara stood behind her family, a shadow in dove grey, her purpose to be invisible. She was the hidden gear in their rickety social machine, the sister whose mind for numbers kept their crumbling estate from collapsing entirely. A secret they were too proud to admit and too desperate to do without. His boots stopped on the polished floor directly in front of her. He was taller than she had imagined, his presence a solid, unmoving wall of black wool and grim intent. A faint, silvery scar cut a line from his temple into his dark hair, a flaw that only sharpened the severe perfection of his features. The whispers in the room died into a vacuum of pure shock. Her stepmother, Lady Beatrice, made a choked sound, a strangled note of horror, that he had chosen to acknowledge the family's drab little secret. "You are Miss Ilara Thorne." His voice was low, devoid of warmth or courtesy. It was the voice of a man accustomed to stating facts and having them accepted. Ilara inclined her head, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. "I am." He did not smile, did not. His eyes were not unkind, but they held no softness. They were the eyes of a man inspecting a property or a column of figures, searching for soundness, for utility. "I have reviewed the Thorne estate accounts for the last 5 years, he said, his voice carrying with its own gravity in the suffocating silence. "The management is impressive. The strategies employed to mitigate insolvency show a considerable and unusual talent." Lady Beatrice paled. Her father, Sir Reginald, looked as though he might faint. This was their shame, the proof of their decline, being laid bare by the most powerful man in the room. But the Duke was not looking at them. He was looking at Ilara. "That talent was yours," he stated. It was not a question. She met his gaze and gave the only honest answer she could. "Yes, Your Grace." A single decisive nod. It was all the confirmation he required. He extended a gloved hand, not in supplication, but in command. "I require a duchess. My estate is in disarray. My accounts are a disaster. I have no need of a decorative vase. I need a partner who understands the difference between assets and liabilities." His gaze held hers, a strange, binding current. "You understand ledgers. You will do. Come with me." He did not wait for an answer. He turned, expecting her to follow. And as her family stared, their faces a mask of apoplectic fury and confusion, Ilara felt a strange, cold calm settle over her. For her entire life she had been a tool, used in secret and resented for her necessity. Here was a man who, for his own stark and unfathomable reasons, was naming her value aloud. She took a single step, then another, leaving her gasping family behind. The great doors of the ballroom closed behind them with a heavy, final sound, shutting out the only world she had ever known. Subscribe for more stories like this. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. The story of how she came to this moment is only just beginning. Her life before that fateful assembly had been a long, quiet lesson in being useful but unseen. The Thorne estate, Briarwood, was a portrait of genteel decay. Its stone facade was stained with damp, and the gardens her mother had once tended were a riot of weeds and thorns. Inside, the rot was financial. Her father, Sir Reginald, was a man who believed his birthright entitled him to a lifestyle his depleted coffers could no longer support. He saw debt as a temporary inconvenience, a vulgar subject to be ignored in favour of a new bottle of claret or a losing wager on a horse. Her stepmother, Lady Beatrice, was a woman lacquered in a thin veneer of social ambition. Her cruelty was domestic and precise, delivered in quiet asides about Alara's plain features, her mousy hair, her preference for the estate office over the drawing-room. Alara's existence was a constant, irritating reminder of the first wife, the one with the dowry that had been spent long ago. Beatrice's hopes and the family's last shillings were poured into her own daughter, Arabella. Beautiful, indolent, and possessing a casual cruelty learned at her mother's knee, Arabella was the family's gilded bait, their one chance to marry their way back to solvency. Alara was the architect of their survival. From the age of 16, she had been the one to sit in the cold, dusty estate office, the ledgers spread before her like a battlefield map. She learned to read the language of creditors, the subtle threats in their polite letters, the tightening deadlines. She renegotiated with tenants, placated merchants, and performed the quiet alchemy of turning a handful of shillings into a passable imitation of stability. Her work was the foundation upon which their precarious social standing was built, yet she was never credited. When a particularly clever arrangement with a grain merchant saved them from ruin one winter, her father had taken the credit at a dinner party, laughing about his own shrewd business sense while Alara ate cold leftovers in the kitchen with the staff. "A woman has no place for such things," her stepmother would say, catching her with an account book. "It is unbecoming. You will curdle your wits and be fit for nothing." And Arabella would mock her, her laughter like the chipping of fine china. Poor Alara, married to her ink and paper. No man wants a wife who can do sums in her head. The only warmth she found was in the company of Mary, a young housemaid who would bring her a cup of hot tea late at night, a small, silent act of kindness in a house that offered none. Mary saw her, not as a strange aberration, but as the lady who kept the roof over their heads. When the invitation to the Duke of Alister's marriage assembly arrived, a shocking honour procured through a distant, influential relative, the household had erupted in a frenzy of planning. Every last coin was spent on a gown of shimmering silk for Arabella. Alara was to attend as her companion, a necessary chaperone, dressed in a serviceable grey gown that had been altered twice. She was a footnote, a piece of scenery. The irony was that it was her careful management that had afforded them the carriage fare to London. She had, in essence, paid for her own effacement. She had stood in that ballroom, a ghost at the feast, expecting nothing, only to have the most powerful man in England look through the glittering facade of her family and see the one thing they had worked so hard to hide: her worth. The carriage ride to Blackwood Manor was conducted in a dense, unnerving silence. Alara sat opposite the Duke, the rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves and the creak of the leather suspension the only sounds between them. He did not look at her. He stared out the window at the darkening countryside, his profile stark against the fleeting landscape. It was not an awkward silence. It was a functional one, the quiet of two people who have concluded a transaction and are now merely awaiting its execution. She used the time to study him. He was a man built of hard lines and controlled force. There was no softness in him, but there was also no pretense. He was precisely what he appeared to be: formidable, unyielding, and utterly self-possessed. This, she thought, was a language she could understand. It was the clear, cold logic of a contract, a world away from the smiling deceptions and emotional barbs of her home. Blackwood Manor rose from the rolling hills like a bastion of stone and shadow. It was enormous, a Gothic masterpiece of stark towers and leaded glass windows that gleamed like obsidian in the fading light. But as they drew closer, she saw the signs of neglect. The grand iron gates were touched with rust, and the sprawling parkland that surrounded the house was untamed. The gardens she could glimpse were a tangled mass of overgrown rose bushes and choked pathways. The house was not derelict, but it was sleeping, a great beast holding its breath. Inside, the air was cold and still, smelling of beeswax, old stone, and something else, a profound, echoing silence. A woman with a ramrod straight spine and hair pulled into a severe grey knot greeted them. Her black dress was immaculate. "Your Grace," she said, her voice crisp. "Mrs. Gable," he acknowledged with a nod. "This is the Duchess. See to her needs." Mrs. Gable's eyes, small and sharp, assessed Ilara from head to toe. There was no welcome in them, only a deep, professional neutrality that was more intimidating than open hostility. A young maid named Clara, with wide, nervous eyes, was summoned to show Ilara to her rooms. The suite was vast and opulent, furnished with heavy, dark wood furniture and rich, faded tapestries. But it was cold. A fire had been laid in the hearth, but not lit. It was a room that had been prepared, but not lived in. An hour later, a footman summoned her to the Duke's study. The room was the heart of the man himself. There were no paintings, no personal effects, only floor-to-ceiling shelves of books, not novels, but treatises on agriculture, law, and engineering, and a massive desk covered in ledgers and maps. The Duke stood by the window, looking out into the night. He turned as she entered. "I will be plain," he began, his voice leaving no room for misunderstanding. "You are now the Duchess of Alastair. This title will afford you my protection and the respect of my station. You will have access to the Alastair fortune for the management of this household and its affairs. You will want for nothing material." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "In return, I require your complete oversight of this estate's administration. The household accounts, the tenant farms, the supply contracts. I have been neglectful. I require competence. I require order." He took a step closer. "What I will not offer is affection. I will not offer companionship beyond what is required for public appearances. My life is my own, as yours will be your own. We will share a roof and a title, but nothing more. This is a business arrangement. Do you understand and accept these terms?" Ilara looked at the clean, unequivocal lines of the contract he was laying before her. No hidden clauses, no emotional blackmail, no demand for a love she did not possess. It was a fortress of cold, hard honesty. It was the safest place she had ever been. "I do, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady. He gave a single, satisfied nod. The transaction was complete. In the first weeks, Blackwood Manor was a kingdom of silence and routine. Ilara rose with the sun, a habit ingrained from years of needing to get to the estate ledgers before her family awoke. She took her breakfast alone in a small, sunless morning room, the food, eggs, toast, coffee, served silently by the watchful Clara. The Duke was a phantom. He was already gone by the time she woke and returned late in the evening, long after she had retired. They were two ships passing in the night, their only communication the occasional, brief nod if their paths crossed in the cavernous main hall. His absence was a relief. It gave her space to breathe, to think, to work. And work was what she did. She began in the heart of the house, the kitchens and the household accounts. She requested the ledgers from a Mr. Davies, the estate steward, a stiff, formal man whose polite deference barely concealed a deep-seated resentment at her intrusion. The books were a catastrophe. Years of mismanagement lay bare in the spidery ink. Overpayments to suppliers who were clearly taking advantage, wasteful redundancies in staff duties, contracts left to expire and renew at ruinous rates. It was a familiar chaos, the same brand of aristocratic neglect she had spent years battling at Briarwood, only on a far grander scale. Methodically, she began to untangle the mess. She summoned the local merchants one by one to the estate office, a room she had claimed as her own. They arrived expecting to deal with the aloof Duke or his ineffectual steward, and were met instead by a quiet young woman in a simple dress who knew the precise market price of flour and the average yield of a dairy cow. Their initial condescension quickly evaporated into grudging respect when she spoke their language, the language of coin and common sense. She renegotiated every contract, her terms firm but fair. She streamlined the household duties, eliminating waste without dismissing a single member of staff, instead reassigning them to more useful tasks. The attitude of the household began to shift, slowly, like a great ship turning. Mrs. Gable, the formidable housekeeper, stopped one day to inform her, with a clipped nod of approval, that the new butcher was providing better cuts for a lower price. Clara, her personal maid, began to chatter quietly as she helped her dress, offering small pieces of gossip about the other staff, a sign of budding trust. One afternoon, seeking air, Elara found her way to the neglected gardens. They were a wild, beautiful ruin, a maze of overgrown rose bushes, their thorny canes reaching for the sky, choked the stone pathways. She found an elderly groundskeeper named Thomas, his back bent from a lifetime of toil. He told her the garden had been the pride of the first Duchess, Cassian's mother. After her death, and the disaster of his first marriage, the Duke had lost all interest. He had let it go to seed, a living monument to his grief and bitterness. On that day, Elara began a new kind of work. She borrowed a pair of thick gloves and shears from Thomas and started to clear the thorns, to prune the dead wood, to stake up the drooping heads of the forgotten roses. The physical labor was a balm, the simple act of bringing order to chaos a deep and satisfying comfort. The Duke began to watch her. She would feel his presence before she saw him, a stillness at the edge of her perception. She would look up from her work in the garden to see him standing at a library window, or catch a glimpse of his dark coat at the end of a long corridor as she emerged from the estate office. He never spoke, never approached. He simply observed, his expression unreadable, a silent witness to the quiet revolution she was leading in his silent house. Late one night, unable to sleep, she went down to the library in search of a book. She found him there, sitting in a large leather armchair by the fire, a volume of architectural plans open on his lap. He looked up as she entered, but made no move to leave. She found her book and took a seat in the opposite chair. For an hour they sat in a shared, profound silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the whisper of turning pages. It was not the empty silence of their dining table, but something new. A quiet coexistence, a fragile peace. The library became their unspoken meeting place, a neutral ground in the vast, cold house. Elara took to spending her evenings there, working on the estate ledgers at a small writing desk near the fire. The Duke would often be present, reading in his customary chair, the silence between them a comfortable, established thing. He was a man of immense stillness, but she was learning to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes would linger on a page as if seeing something far beyond the words. She was reorganizing the estate archives, a chaotic jumble of deeds, maps, and correspondence that had been left to gather dust for generations. Her goal was to create a system, a logical order that would make the information accessible and useful. It was while sorting through a collection of land law treatises on a high shelf that her fingers brushed against something solid tucked behind the books. It was a slim, leather-bound folio, unmarked and locked with a small, tarnished brass clasp. Curiosity, a feeling she rarely indulged, pricked at her. Later that week, the Duke was called away to London on urgent business, a matter of politics he had mentioned in a clipped, rare sentence at breakfast. He was gone for 3 days. On the second night of his absence, the silence of the great house felt heavier, more pronounced. In his study, where she had gone to find a specific map of the tenant farms, she saw his ring of keys left carelessly on the corner of his desk. Among them was a small, ornate brass key. On impulse, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs, she took it. Back in the library, the key slid into the lock of the folio with a soft click. The contents were not old deeds or forgotten letters. They were financial documents, crisp and modern, arranged in chronological order. Her breath caught in her throat. The papers detailed the debts of Sir Reginald Thorne, her father's debts. She saw it all laid out in stark black and white. The gambling losses, the mortgaged fields, the promissory notes sold to increasingly desperate lenders. And on each document, another name appeared. The Duke of Alistair. For the past year, Cassian Vale had been systematically, quietly, buying up her family's ruin. The final document was a deed of loan, the one that would have triggered the final collapse of the Briarwood estate, the debt that would have left them utterly destitute. It had been acquired by the Duke 1 week before the marriage assembly. The cold, hard clarity of her situation fractured. This wasn't a random choice. This wasn't a powerful man simply seeking a competent manager. He had engineered it. He had cornered her family, waited for their desperation to peak, and then he had stepped in to claim her. Was this protection, or was it a purchase? Was she his duchess, or his most cleverly acquired asset? The clean, honest contract he had offered her now felt like the most sophisticated lie of all. The foundation of their strange, quiet life crumbled into dust. She placed the papers back in the folio, locked it, and sat down in her chair by the cold hearth to wait for him to come home. He returned the following evening, his face drawn and tired from his journey. He found her in the library, the fire unlit, the room cast in the long blue shadows of twilight. The leather folio sat on the small table between their 2 chairs. His eyes went to it immediately, and a flicker of something, surprise, or perhaps resignation, crossed his features. He said nothing, merely unfastened his greatcoat and laid it over a chair before taking his seat opposite her. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations. Elara was the first to break it, her voice lower than usual, but perfectly steady. "I believe this belongs to you, Your Grace. I confess I do not understand its contents. Perhaps you could explain why you spent a year purchasing my family's ruin." He did not flinch or dissemble. He met her gaze directly, his own as cool and grey as a winter sea. "There is little to explain," he said, his tone factual, detached. "The information is accurate. I bought the debts." "Why?" The word was a shard of ice. "Was this your plan all along? To force my family's hand? To acquire me along with their other distressed properties?" For the first time since she had met him, his composure seemed to crack. A muscle feathered in his jaw. "Acquire you," he repeated, the words clipped. "Do not mistake my methods for my motive. I first became aware of your talents 2 years ago during a land dispute with your father. He was attempting a foolish legal maneuver, and his solicitor's arguments were clumsy. But the correspondence from his estate office, the financial projections, the counter-proposals, they were brilliant, precise, strategic. They were not the work of Sir Reginald." He leaned forward slightly. "I made inquiries. I discovered the Thorne estate was managed not by its fool of a master, but by his hidden daughter. I also learned that he was squandering every penny you saved, that he was negotiating to marry you off to Lord Ashworth, a man of even weaker character and greater debts than his own. He looked away from her then, towards the cold fireplace. "My first marriage," he said, his voice dropping, losing its hard edge, "was to a woman celebrated for her beauty and charm. She filled this house with laughter and parties and people. She also conspired with my cousin to embezzle a third of my fortune, and, when discovered, attempted to have me declared mentally incompetent. I learned then that the qualities society values in a wife are often the very instruments of a man's destruction." His gaze returned to her, and now it was raw, unguarded. "I vowed I would not make that mistake again. I needed a partner, not a parasite. I saw in you a mind that was my equal. I saw competence, honor, and strength, qualities your family saw as a liability. I knew they would eventually discard you or sell you. Buying their debts was not a means to purchase you, madam. It was a means to secure you, to ensure that once you were free of them, they would have no further claim, no leverage to interfere. It was a firewall, a cold, unromantic, but necessary transaction to protect a valuable asset." He finally corrected himself. "To protect my future." The confession was breathtaking in its cold-blooded logic. He had seen her, not as a woman to be courted, but as a strategic partner to be secured. He had not rescued her, he had recruited her. And yet, beneath the chilling calculation, there was an undeniable, startling truth. He had recognized her value when no one else had. He had seen her work, her mind, herself, and deemed it essential. It was the most profound form of respect she had ever been shown. The anger in her chest did not vanish, but it transformed into something else, something complex and fragile. She looked at this strange, damaged, brutally honest man, and made a choice. "An asset can be sold, Your Grace," she said quietly. "A partner cannot." A flicker of understanding passed between them. The foundation had been shattered, but here, in the rubble, they were beginning to build something new. The first test of their new, unspoken alliance arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon in the form of a black lacquered carriage. Elara was in the garden, her hands covered in soil from replanting lavender along the stone path when she saw it approach. Lord Ashworth, the man her father had intended for her before Arabella's more promising prospects had emerged. He was handsome in a soft, polished way, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He represented everything she despised about her former life, the veneer of civility masking a core of selfish ambition. He was shown into the main drawing room, a cavernous space Elara rarely used. She found him standing by the windows, admiring the view as if he were already its master. The Duke was there, too, standing silently by the fireplace, a dark, watchful presence. Ashworth turned as she entered, his smile widening. "Elara, my dear, forgive the intrusion. I had to come. Your family, we have all been so terribly worried." His voice was a confection of false concern. "To be swept away by a man of the Duke's reputation, we feared for your safety, for your happiness." He took a step towards her, his eyes flicking towards the Duke with a hint of challenge. "You must know, whatever has transpired, that your place is with us, with your family, with me. I came to assure you that you have a home to return to." It was a carefully crafted performance, designed to paint her as a victim, a prisoner in a gilded cage. He was planting the seeds of social scandal, attempting to isolate her and undermine her position. The old Elara would have shrunk from such a confrontation, would have murmured a polite refusal, and fled. But she was not the old Elara. She was the Duchess of Alistair, the woman who had brought this great house back from the brink of chaos. She met his gaze, her own cool and steady. "My Lord Ashworth," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the large room, My safety is not, nor has it ever been, your concern. My family made their choices regarding my welfare long ago. Now I have made mine." She took a half-step back, aligning herself with the silent figure by the fire. "The Duke has offered me more honesty in a few months than my family offered in a lifetime. Your concern is as unwelcome as it is transparent." The smile finally slipped from Ashworth's face, replaced by a flash of angry pride. "You choose this recluse over your own blood, over a man who offered you his name." "You offered me a business arrangement, my lord, one that would have benefited you and my father," she replied, her voice cutting. "His Grace offered me one as well. His was simply the more honest of the two." Before Ashworth could retort, the Duke moved. He didn't speak. He simply came to stand beside her, his presence a solid wall of support. He placed a hand on the small of her back, a quiet, possessive gesture that was both a comfort to her and a clear dismissal to their visitor. It was a public declaration of unity. Then, and only then, did he speak, his voice a low rumble of command. "You have heard the Duchess. Her decision is made. You will leave my house now." Ashworth flushed a deep, mottled red. Defeated, he gave a stiff, jerky bow and departed, the grand doors closing behind him with a note of finality. Elara did not watch him go. She was looking at the Duke, a silent gratitude passing between them. He had not rescued her. He had stood with her while she rescued herself. That night, the library felt different. The fire burned brightly, casting a warm, flickering glow over the shelves of books and the two figures seated in the worn leather armchairs. The silence that fell between them was no longer one of mere coexistence. It was charged with the aftermath of the day's victory, rich with unspoken understanding. Elara finally broke it, her voice soft. "Thank you for what you did today." The Duke looked up from his book, his grey eyes catching the firelight. "I did nothing. You required no assistance. You stood with me," she corrected gently. "That was not nothing." He inclined his head, accepting the distinction. The silence returned, but it was a comfortable weight, a shared space. He watched her across the hearth, his gaze intense, analytical, as if he were trying to solve a particularly complex equation. She had grown accustomed to his scrutiny, but tonight it felt different. Less like observation, more like seeing. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, stripped of its usual commanding tone. It was the plain, factual voice of a man stating an irrefutable truth. "The terms of our arrangement," he said, "are no longer accurate." Elara's heart gave a strange, sharp flutter. She waited, holding her breath. "When you first arrived," he continued, his eyes fixed on her face, "this house was a collection of rooms. It was a structure, an inheritance. Silent, empty, I preferred it that way." He paused, as if measuring his next words with immense care. "Now, there is order. The accounts are sound. The tenants are not being cheated. There is life in the garden." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a profound vulnerability in his gaze. "But it is more than that. When I am away from this house, I find myself thinking of the light in this room. When I sit here across from you, the silence is not empty. It is peaceful." He set his book aside, his movements slow, deliberate. "You are not an asset to be protected, Elara. You are the foundation upon which this is all being rebuilt. This was a shell. You have made it a home." He stood and crossed the small space between them. He did not reach for her in passion, but with a quiet, reverent gravity. He knelt before her chair and took her hand, his large, warm fingers enclosing hers. Her hands were not the soft, useless hands of a lady. They were capable, often smudged with ink from the ledgers or soil from the garden. He turned her hand over and traced the lines on her palm with his thumb. "The contract is void," he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion she could not name. "This is something else." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. It was not a gesture of fealty or passion. It was a seal. A quiet, devastating acknowledgement of a truth that had grown between them in the silence. The annual Alistair ducal ball had been a thing of legend, but the Duke had not hosted one in the decade since his first wife's betrayal. Its revival was the talk of the season, a signal to society that the reclusive Duke was re-emerging, and a command to formally receive his new, mysterious Duchess. The ballroom at Blackwood, shuttered for years, was now ablaze with the light of 1,000 candles, reflecting off polished marble and gilded ceilings. Society had come to stare, to whisper, to judge. Ilara saw them all, the curious, the envious, and the malicious. Her family was there, their presence a requirement they could not refuse. Sir Reginald's face was a blotchy mask of resentment, while Lady Beatrice and Arabella watched her with undisguised venom. They saw her not as a daughter or sister, but as a stolen prize. Ilara stood beside her husband, her hand resting on his arm. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk, a colour as deep and quiet as the night sky. The Alistair diamonds, cool and heavy, rested against her throat. But her confidence came not from the gown or the jewels, but from the solid presence of the man beside her. They were a united front. Midway through the evening, the confrontation they had been expecting arrived. Her father, emboldened by wine and desperation, approached them, Lord Ashworth at his side. They had brought with them a weaselly-looking man, a known moneylender from London. "Your Grace," Sir Reginald began, his voice overloud, drawing the attention of those nearby. "A matter of some urgency has come to my attention. It seems your acquisition of my financial obligations was not entirely legal. In fact, Mr. Finch here," he said, indicating the moneylender, "is prepared to testify that you coerced him, rendering the transaction void, which in turn makes this marriage, predicated on that financial arrangement, fraudulent. It was a desperate, public gamble, an attempt to humiliate them and force an annulment, hoping to claw back some control." The surrounding guests fell silent, their eyes wide with scandal. The Duke, Cassian, showed no surprise. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible signal to his steward, Mr. Davies, who stepped forward and handed him a slim folder. But it was Ilara who spoke. Her voice, though quiet, was imbued with an authority that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "Fraud, father. Shall we speak of fraud?" She looked not at him, but at the assembled guests. "For 7 years I managed the finances of the Briarwood estate. I can tell you, to the shilling, the cost of every bottle of claret you consumed while our tenants' roofs leaked. I have the ledgers detailing the funds diverted from farm repairs to pay for Arabella's gowns." She then turned her clear, dissecting gaze on Ashworth. "And I have the correspondence from you, my lord, proposing a merger of your debts with ours, with myself as the collateral to be sold to the highest bidder." The colour drained from their faces. She was not emotional. She was not accusatory. She was simply stating facts, laying their grubby secrets bare with the cold precision of an audit. The crowd stared, mesmerized. Then Cassian spoke, his voice a low, proud counterpoint to hers. "My wife," he said, his gaze sweeping the room, "is the most astute financial mind in England. This estate, my fortune, is solvent and growing for the first time in a generation, entirely due to her stewardship." He opened the folder. "This is a signed confession from Mr. Finch, detailing the bribe Sir Reginald and Lord Ashworth offered him to perjure himself tonight. Officers are waiting outside." Sir Reginald sputtered, his face collapsing in ruin. Ashworth was frozen in disbelief. In front of all of society, Cassian lifted Ilara's hand to his lips. "My greatest asset is not my title," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction for all to hear. "It is my Duchess." The public validation was absolute. As her family was discreetly escorted from the hall in disgrace, the whispers that followed them were not of scandal, but of a new and formidable power couple. Months later, the Rose Garden was a symphony of color and scent. What had been a tangled ruin was now a masterpiece of order and life, the result of months of shared work between Ilara, old Thomas, and, to her surprise, Cassian himself, who had taken to spending his weekend afternoons working alongside her in comfortable silence. The air was warm, filled with the hum of bees. They walked the crushed stone paths, their shoulders occasionally brushing. The easy silence between them was now their natural language, punctuated by quiet conversation about plans for the estate, a new crop rotation for the north fields, repairs for the tenants' cottages. These were not the discussions of a business arrangement, but the shared dreams of a home. He stopped beside a trellis heavy with white roses, the variety his mother had planted decades ago. He reached out and touched a petal, his expression thoughtful. He turned to her, his grey eyes soft in the morning light. The severity that had once defined his features had been weathered away, replaced by a quiet contentment she knew was a mirror of her own. "Ilara," he said. It was still a small jolt to hear him use her given name, a privilege he reserved for their most private moments. It felt like a key turning in a lock. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "When I proposed our contract, I told you I could not offer affection." His thumb stroked the back of her hand. "It was the only dishonest thing I have ever said to you. I believe I was already beginning to feel it then, though I refused to name it. I saw your mind, your strength, and I was lost." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "The terms are long since void. The ledgers are balanced. The house is in order. All that remains is the truth." He paused and then said the words with the same simple, factual gravity he used for all things he knew to be certain. "I love you." A slow, radiant smile spread across her face, a genuine, unguarded expression of joy that was still new to her. She leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of roses and the clean, familiar scent of him. "I know," she whispered, her voice filled with a peace that felt as deep and rooted as the ancient oaks that dotted the parkland. "I love you too, Cassian." They stood together for a long time, two solitary people who had found their home in each other, their linked hands a testament to a partnership forged in ink and soil, in silence and in truth. What began as a transaction had become the defining reality of their lives, a love as sturdy and resilient as the roses they had coaxed back to life. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Would you have trusted a man who bought your family's debts to set you free? Let us know in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from. The best alliances, after all, often begin as the most honest transactions.